Kia ora, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'd like to acknowledge my counterpart, Peter Miskimmon. He's doing a terrific, and you and your team are doing a terrific job for New Zealand sport, and we value our partnership very much. I have to say, that first speaker, what an act to follow. Wasn't it amazing? And it reminded me of a story. I was recently in our Melbourne office, and one of our engineers is from the Holden racing team. He worked for Holden racing team, and he uses our 3D printer to print a range of things for our para-athletes. And I was marvelling at what he was doing, these incredible things that the athletes put into, their hands into to grip their wheels, the seats that they travel in aircraft, or in wheelchairs. So I was, pumping his tyres up a bit and saying how terrific he was, but I'd just come back from the Commonwealth Games, and I said, well, look, you think you're so smart. Did you watch the para-triathlon? And I don't know if you saw it, but these amazing athletes on their back, on their cycles, and when they get back to transition, they have to get out of their bike and into a chair. And it's really hard. The handlers can pick, generally, the women up because they're lighter, but to get their legs in. But if they're dead weight, some of them, our Nick Beveridge, our para-athlete, is paralysed from the chest down. To get him out of his bike and into his chair I just was holding my breath. So I said to our engineer, you think you're so damn smart with this 3D printer. And now I said to him, have you seen Transformers? What we need is a cycle that just goes click, 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 and it's a wheelchair and off you go. And he said, oh, how much money have you got? And I said, you're so smart, off you go, let's do this. So it's funny how dots join, because today I learned that actually this is possible. Because exponential development, if we can 3D print these things, transform a cycle to chair seems easy. Interesting though, we met with a motor vehicle company, and we raised this and said, isn't this amazing? They said, we're going to get our global team onto that right away. And so I just, listening to that was just so exciting, because I thought, some problems that we need to solve for our athletes. So I was appointed to this position just over 14 months ago, and the board's appointed me with a transformation agenda. I guess I've had that time now to consider what impact we can have as an organisation, what the game changers are, what should be prioritised, and what contribution we can make to our community. What are the opportunities to design and deliver a better future for Australian sport? So the Australian Sports Commission is slightly different to Sport New Zealand. The Commission is owned by the Commonwealth Government of Australia, through which the government funds essentially all of its investment in sport, around $200 million per annum, covering high performance and community participation programs. We also run the world-renowned Australian Institute of Sport. It's a really exciting opportunity for me, but I also see it as an exciting period of opportunity ahead for Australian sport. Opportunity that can, if we get it right, bring profound and lasting benefit to Australian sport and society for decades to come. It also does bring significant responsibilities, though, for the sporting community, like you, to ensure the opportunities are capitalised on and consolidated for our long-term benefit. I'm going to discuss what I see as the most significant opportunities for the Australian sports system. But before I start, I just wanted you to take, and I saw you so well behaved this morning in terms of connecting with your neighbour. Now you've connected with them, I want you to just take a minute and actually explore what you think the most significant opportunity is for New Zealand sport. Just one thing that I want you to agree on with your neighbour is the most significant opportunity in the coming years. So you've got a minute. Okay. Let's get back into it. Is anyone willing to put their hand up and tell me what that is? Is someone willing to put their hand up and tell me what that significant opportunity is? Everyone? Someone willing to tell me what that is? Diversity. Another one? Any others? Come on, there must be others. Did you all agree on diversity? I actually agree that's a pretty good one, I have to say. Karen Smith, well done. Yeah. Engagement, yes. Others? Yeah. Disability? Accessibility, yes, for disability as well as a range of other populations. Anything else? Technology, yep, we saw that this morning, amazing opportunities. Our aspiration is to be the most active sporting nation. We're happy to have a competition with you on that one. A healthy and successful sporting nation known for our integrity, vibrant participation base, thriving sport organisations and world-leading sport industry. One pressing issue is we as a society need to become a lot less complacent about in a hurry. It's about how unfit and obese our children are becoming. Well, actually, it's everyone, but especially children. Anyone with children knows the challenges that technology and iPhones present to getting them off the couch. We heard a little bit about that this morning. It's a global challenge for parents today. What's unique and surprising for Australia in the way the traditional bedrock of lifelong physical activity in our country, PE in schools, is gradually being marginalised in the government school curricula. It's more and more an optional or low priority item, competing with numerous other claims on the school day. And this is not a criticism of teachers, they have got crowded curricula. A recent report into PE in Victorian state schools concluded that only 9% met the state guidelines for physical education programs. The data at all levels, young and old, is disturbing. The Productivity Commission recently reported that 11.7 million Australians, 66% over 18, exercise little or not at all. Type 2 diabetes now affects 5% of the population. So that sporting nation, Australia, is quickly on the decline. It's not a good omen for the country economically. It's guaranteed to drive up long-term health costs. A recent BCG report concluded that every dollar invested in sport and physical activity drives a $7 return to the country, largely driven by avoided future health costs. It's also not a good omen for our future sporting success. It's self-evident that a country with a smaller base of physically active and capable young people will have a diminished long-term capability for success at the highest levels. It just makes sense, doesn't it? And it's not a good long-term omen for a country that wants to sell itself internationally in business as a successful sporting nation. The Australian Sports Commission is doing its bit by funding the Sporting Schools program and developing a new national physical literacy standard that, when operationalised, will help children to learn to move competently and confidently. In fact, the Commission is working closely with Sport New Zealand on that area. We believe parents have a right to know how their children are progressing. The opportunity is to stop counting the numbers of schools and children, so stop counting widgets and start measuring impact. It matters that Australia continues its proud standing and tradition in world sport, that future generations of Australian kids are inspired and motivated to be active, to participate in sport and enjoy all the benefits that sport brings, to have that inner confidence that they can do it, that they have the skills and ability to belong in sport and to enjoy it. The evidence backs up what common sense tells us instinctively, that fit and active kids overall have stronger mental health and do better at school. Dick Telford in Australia did a study in the south of Victoria with about 80 children, and that work showed and proved that children involved in his physical activity program scored higher in their NAPLAN scores. That's a scalable project that is now going to be extended into Victoria. We do need the evidence of this. Team sports in particular promote social inclusion and cohesion, and ever more important in today's world. They teach lifelong personal qualities such as resilience, courage, teamwork, winning with humility, and losing graciously. I've always admired New Zealand for the fact that on the Global Gender Gap Index, you were placed 9th. Australia, not surprisingly, sits well down the pack at 46. We're just below the US. The index recognises equality in education and health. Australia does pretty well on that measure. And economic power and political influence, both areas where Australia scores low. You won't be surprised to know that Scandinavian countries lead the way in the first 4 places. When I talked to Kay Thompson about that, she said, well, but what's it like in sport? Is New Zealand's 9th place a true reflection of the sport gender gap? What percentage of your national federation CEO are female? And we heard your minister talking about that this morning. Is there equal participation by gender in sport? How many female coaches are coaching at the elite level? I was shocked when I heard on the Gold Coast that at the Rio Olympics, only 11% of the coaches in Rio were female. I was just astonished. Is media coverage balanced here in New Zealand? Do corporate New Zealand invest in equally in women's sport? I certainly believe Australia's 46th place is a true reflection of the sport gender gap in Australia. However, here's the opportunity. It's an opportunity in women's sport. As the rise of female empowerment grows in our country and yours, there's no mistaking female empowerment as a societal trend. It will shape and change our society in the decades to come. I hope it's on that curve that we heard Kayla talk about this morning. Women's sport will become a driving factor and beneficiary of that trend. It's become a huge deal in Australia. At the Sydney Olympic Games, our female athletes won 30% of all medals won by Australians. In London 2012 and Rio 2016 Games, that figure was around 60%. Be really interested in what your data says. All of our traditional male professional sports, Australian rules, cricket, football, rugby league and union, have launched elite women's competitions, and these are proving very popular with the public. The AFL Women's League was named the 2nd most powerful cultural force in Australia after its inaugural year. I did joke with Gilla McLaughlin that, about the fact that AFL thinks that they invented women's sport, but the power of a brand like the AFL, who can actually buy the middle 6 pages of a newspaper, it's very hard for sports to compete against that. All the codes report that women and girls competitions are the fastest growing parts of their sport at the community level, growing at the reach and revenue base of all codes. And they're achieving international success. Our women's cricket team are world champions. Our women's rugby sevens team won the gold medal in Rio against New Zealand. And you repaid the favour, beating Australia gold on the Gold Coast. Well done, New Zealand. A warning here. We can't be complacent. There's such a long way to go. You can't be what you can't see. So every time I see a panel without women sitting on it, if you can't see women on televisions or in the newspaper, our young females in our country won't believe that it's possible. The male champions of change sport are also making a large difference to the sport gender gap. These men are the most influential leaders in Australian sport. They hold each other to account in a range of areas. And one really interesting story, Todd Greenberg, the CEO of the NRL, was asked to be on a panel talking about sport business. And he arrived not thinking, got up onto the stage, sat down, looked along at all of the other panel members and saw there were no women. So he stood up and said, look, I'm really sorry, but I've made a panel pledge as part of the Male Champions of Change. I'll never speak on a panel where there are no females. So I can't do this. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to step down. Unless there's someone in the audience, a female in the audience, who would like to come and join us. Now, it wasn't a setup. Truly it wasn't. But a woman put up her hand and said, I'll do it. And so she came up and sat next to Todd and he went ahead on the stage. The message was so powerful that happened. And it's something now that, people expect. So the Champions of Change set clear targets and they report annually against their progress. Liz Broderick, who chairs the Champions of Change, reports so that these influential men in Australian sport are actually held to account. They do have female advisors. When it was first announced, I thought, there I go, there's another thing I'm going to miss out on. All the blokes are going to get round, have a chat, I'm going to miss out. But so Liz very cleverly brought on females into this so that there is a voice at the table for females as well. Their focus is increasing women's participation in sport at all levels, developing more inclusive sporting cultures, advancing more women in leadership positions, and achieving pay equity in sports management, and pathways to pay equity in for women athletes. One interesting project, and this is a challenge for you later on, was to review the face of each organisation. What did their websites and other communications say about their commitment to gender equity? Not surprisingly, their public faces were in most cases very male and often very white. You'll be pleased to know that that's changed. Just take a moment and think about that, how your website reflects diversity in New Zealand. There's also a significant opportunity to recognise and celebrate one of the greatest forces for good the world over. A whole new genre of elite athletes and role models in the form of our para-athletes. Australia has come to respect and admire our nation's leading para-athletes, incredible human beings with the most amazing, inspiring stories of personal struggle and success you'll ever hear. Their stories speak to, inspire and motivate not just those with disabilities, but the entire community. They remind us how sport in the most narrow sense is about the contest on the sporting field, but in the broader sense about something much bigger. It's about life, its challenges and overcoming adversity. My favourite moments from the Commonwealth Games: imagine a fully integrated program, imagine equal medal events for males and females. Lauren Parker, young woman, so Kurt Fernley, his last race for Australia, a man that marathon by marathon has changed the face of para sport in our country. Young Lauren Parker, 10 months before the Commonwealth Games, came second in an Ironwoman. Her 2 weeks before the World Championships, her tyres blew out and she was competing for Australia at the Commonwealth Games. Really just such an inspiring young woman that she could actually, and look, you've got to balance that out because, you know, it's early days for her. She's got a bit of a journey to go on. Smart organisations in Australia have come to recognise the power and authenticity of the Paralympic brand and our leading para-athletes and have increasingly aligned themselves with it. Sports are reframing difference as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to walk the talk of their values, an opportunity to strengthen their contribution to healthier and happier communities. The story of Mark Reichler-Stillhart is both heartwarming and sad. Mark, who has Down syndrome, has integrated into mainstream schools and the local sporting clubs in a local country community. This community embraced Mark. He plays soccer with his mates as the 12th man. The opposition teams have never had a problem with this. As a 16-year-old in an under-14 competition, he can make a contribution. He's a lot smaller than his peers and he has some coordination issues. Sadly, an opposition club made a complaint, which was ultimately upheld by the local association. And I know it's so much easier as a volunteer to be really black and white. I know how hard it is, but it's also really easy to actually be more inclusive. Journalist Peter Fitzsimons, who wrote about this story, said, "This is kids' sport. This is about fun. This is about inclusion, about humanity." Social media became the voice for Mark as we all tweeted, #LetHimPlay. It's really interesting for you in your communities about how you include people rather than designing designing programs for everyone is much easier than designing a program and then say, look, we're going to adjust it for you. Increasingly, Australia has a two-tiered sporting economy. Those sports who generate billions from broadcast deals, you would have read it in the paper, AFL 2.5 billion, NRL 1.8, cricket 1.2, all across 5 or 6 years. And those who are largely dependent on government for revenue. I was quite surprised about the reliance in Australia on government funding, up to 80-90% of revenue from government, which is not sustainable in the long term. There are 3 sports in Australia that actually generate a large proportion of own source revenue. Those 3 sports are football, round ball football, rugby and netball. So about 80% of their revenue is from external sources. It's a massive opportunity in strengthening the capability of our sport industry through a different approach, an approach that focuses on improved governance, a stronger and more capable workforce, robust strategy, and in Australia, a solution for the increasingly frustrating federated operating model. Your new head of High Performance Sport New Zealand, Michael, you'll be very familiar with that story. This is a model that duplicates expenditure, it fragments commercial opportunities, it brings out the worst, absolute worst behaviours I've ever seen, and it slows decision-making to a neglectful pace. It's time for a revolution in the governance of sport in Australia. Watch this space. All organisations that enjoy the benefits of taxpayer funding through the ASC have a responsibility to run their organisations consistent with modern best practice, with the lowest reasonable administration and overhead costs, with organisational cultures that are positive and inclusive and respect female executives. They need to be transparent and avoid old-fashioned mates and patronage networks that belong in the last century. Supporting this governance reform is a new way of doing business. We're going to put aside our 1984 Nokia Action Man. Can you believe that someone in Australia said that's what it's like with dealing with sport in Australia? It's like having your old Nokia phone. We're going to put this aside and create an opportunity through digital transformation. There's a significant cultural chain and mindset shift required in the area to move from thinking we need a digital strategy to we need to be a digital business and a digital sport industry. It's not about bolting it on the side. We need to put it in a way of thinking. It's a new lens over everything. We heard about technological innovation and disruption having a profound effect on our lives. Sport is really no exception, you know that. There's a whole new world out there in exploring new frontiers in sport. Artificial intelligence that can provide best of the best coaching techniques and replace traditional coaching. The constant advances in sport equipment and apparel, and advances in psychological conditioning to optimise human performance. I said in my opening remarks that these opportunities also bring responsibilities if they're to be taken full advantage of. In that context, I want to talk about the Australian high performance experience. There's no doubt that Australia suffered an Olympics hangover after the Sydney 2000 Games. We performed exceptionally well in those games and the Olympics after that in Athens. This has not been sustained, and there's lessons to be learned from that. Australia increased its investment in its high-performance sporting programs in the lead-up to its home Olympics, but this investment has declined in real terms in the past decade, and I believe immediately after those Olympics. At the same time, many other countries have substantially increased their investment. While many factors determine success, not just money, there is a little doubt that in the long term there's a direct correlation between funding and national high-performance sports programs and success. This is the background and genesis for Winning Edge program that the Australian Sports Commission launched with a view to turning around our Olympic performance that has seen us slip progressively from 58 medals in Sydney to 29 in Rio, from 4th to 10th on the medal table. Some people would say that we need to be realistic about that. We know that our professional sports in Australia suck up many of the talented athletes in Australia. So it's about money, it's about where professional sports who are paying their athletes millions of dollars. It's about other nations investing more and being quite strategic about where they invest if they want performance outcomes. Australians are passionate about their sport and Australian sporting success on the world stage. It's our country's DNA and self-image in so many ways. And so while a top 10 placing is pretty respectable for a country the size of Australia, we aim for greater success. AWE, which is now a label that we don't use, it doesn't have a name, our high performance strategy, it's our Australian National High Performance Strategy, was the first stage of a revolution of Australian high performance sport. This gave sports more control over how they ran their high performance programs in locations closer to where athletes live and train. We've given sports more responsibility, but with that goes more accountability, given that they have using taxpayers' funding. We believe long term that sports that stand on their own 2 feet, make decisions for themselves and take ownership of those decisions are more likely to be effective. Sports on the whole have responded pretty well. It's taken them since that change in AWE to capture that though. However, this next stage of change in the system is more revolutionary. The reason I appointed Peter Condy. The AS is going through a massive transformation, along with the remainder of the organisation. I quote the AS Director Peter Condy, "The organisation must take significant and necessary change to be a world leader. The focus will be on a united high-performance system, efficient and effective investment, technology and innovation, and athlete wellbeing. In addition, the AIS site will be revitalised to be fit for purpose. That is, it needs to support our AIS strategy. So you're talking about a 65-hectare site with about $500 million worth of infrastructure, ageing infrastructure. Some of the facilities are now community facilities. It is not fit for purpose. The lesson for Australian sport is to keep reinventing ourselves, be unafraid of change to avoid staleness and complacency creeping in. Taking our sports system back to the good old days when we were world beaters is not an option. In the next few months, our Minister will launch a national sports plan for Australia, which will provide for the first time a comprehensive and integrated set of public goals for Australian sport and a plan to achieve them. This plan will outline our ambitions for participation in sport and physical activity, for high performance and integrity. A vital and growing challenge and significant opportunity is that sport needs to maintain at its core our strong ethics and values, an unqualified commitment to integrity. And it was interesting, Linda, when you challenged the Minister about, are we sure? Are we absolutely sure? We're lucky in Australia. We have a natural commitment to fair play and good values in sport. Don't laugh yet. Overwhelmingly demonstrated in action by our leading sports stars and sporting organisations. But integrity is a rising challenge everywhere in the world. In an increasingly winner-takes-all world, the incentives to get to the top and win at all costs keeps getting bigger. We heard about gene editing this morning. It's happening. It's not coming, it's happening. The know-how to do that illicitly, including new frontiers, keep expanding. While we as a country cannot vouch that all our athletes are clean, I believe our system is fundamentally clean. Australia's visceral reaction to WADA's report of systematic state-sponsored cheating by Russia at the Sochi Olympic Games and to the recent collusion to cheat by the Australian men's cricket team showed our intense dislike of cheating. I'd also like to point to the appalling events in US gymnastics, which has brought home to all of us that sports working with children need to be ever vigilant. Parents won't entrust their kids to any sport where there are any question marks about integrity and safety on this front. The Australian Sports Commission has a policy of zero tolerance for behaviour that risks the wellbeing of children and young people. Child safety measures must now be prioritised and embedded in every Australian sporting organisation at every level. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night. This is thinking about what's coming in sport in Australia. The world of sport is becoming increasingly challenging. We face complex issues on a daily basis. How would you have handled the Israel-Folau situation? Just think about it for a minute. Raelene Castle, I've heard all of the background on that. How would you make a decision about that? It's a really difficult thing. What are the decision that the IAAF means that Semenya will have to begin taking the female sex hormone oestrogen or hang up her running shoes? I don't know whether you've seen Michael Phelps, his body. It's actually doesn't look normal. But, Michael Phelps could compete. He had feet that actually act like flippers because of his flexion. He has a really short legs but a really long trunk. His arm span is actually wider than his height. So what to that decision? It's going to go now obviously to CAS. It's a really difficult thing. How do you prepare for an athlete taking action for a sport for racial vilification and sexual harassment, as a current AFL player is doing who played in past years? What is to come in the face of concussion, as we've seen in our NFL in the US? Transgender. An AFL athlete, Mountsie, is now playing, it's round ball, it's an Olympic event. She will be at, because of the Olympic qualifications, she'll be able to play, but she's not allowed to play AFL at the moment. What about the Commonwealth Games athletes who are now asylum seekers in Australia? Apparently it's in a 3-digit figures, the number of asylum seekers. How do you deal with all of these big issues in sport? How do you as administrators? But what about community sport? Safeguarding children, management of privacy, protecting officials and volunteers at the coalface, all of the challenges that come with being a reasonably low-resourced and mainly volunteer workforce. Despite this, there's lots to be optimistic about. I've talked today mainly about opportunities, the opportunities for Australian sport to transform itself. This is a journey that we are on. It's by 30th of June this year, we will be in our new structure, and our new strategy will be released as part of the National Sport Plan. It's going to be a really long journey for our industry, but change is required. There are so many opportunities for sport in Australia and for you here in New Zealand. It is the most unifying vehicle of all, sport. I'd like to thank you for the commitment that you make both professionally and personally. The industry wouldn't work in Australia or here in New Zealand without our professional workforce, but also the many volunteers that work at every single level. You strengthen our industry, and I suspect work in this industry for the same reason that I do, that we can make a massive difference to our communities, so it is worth the effort. I'd like to thank you for your time today, and good luck for the rest of the conference.
Right. Thank you, Kate. Plenty of questions for you, which you shouldn't be surprised about, because that was a really interesting presentation and it covered a great many areas. Let's start with one of the first questions that came through from the audience, actually, and that was, what opportunities, if any, do you see for New Zealand and Australian sport to connect, or New Zealand and Australia to connect as countries to assist sport from its grassroots level right through to its high performance?
Yeah, look, there's really no barriers. I think it's about determining what our priorities, where there's an ability to connect. And physical literacy is one of those things that we're working quite closely on now. Our team, in actual fact, were here in New Zealand last week talking about what that looked like. We know that this is a really good solution across populations, so it's not just for children. Our focus at the moment is in children. But interestingly, we received some funding from a different portfolio than sport, which is important for the 65 plus population. And so the physical literacy piece will be important for that too. But there's many other things that we talked about. Women's sport is a really good example of that. We need to get much more strategic in Australia about how we manage that because of all the barriers to participation. So I actually see lots of opportunities. It's just about, well, actually Peter and I talked about it last night, and Peter suggested that we perhaps have a contact that actually makes sure that we continue to engage in an effective way.
I mean, it's interesting because as we heard from the Minister this morning, and you're talking about, a federal policy being announced in Australia very shortly. I mean, the position of sport is changing. Governments are seeing sport in a different way, so therefore there will be more opportunities to work together, not just to be competitors on the field, if you like, but to be able to be two sporting philosophies that can learn from each other.
Yeah, look, in Australia, I was probably one of the things I was quite surprised about in terms of the central Commonwealth government understanding of sport. I've got my little mantra at the moment is mainstreaming sport across government, because there's so many things that sport can do to deliver on government policy, in infrastructure, in health, in education, in women, in ageing. So all of these things, but most of those departments would have very little knowledge of what we do. In actual fact, it's quite astonishing that they don't. So I think there is a huge opportunity for us to be better connected into government. And certainly our ministers, and listening to your minister this morning, our minister's the same. Her passion for sport and physical activity and recreation is massive. And you do need someone in your corner, but you also need other ministers. And I was interested to hear using his power as the Minister for Finance to actually get education and health at the table. And if that's what it takes, I would make the absolute most of that while he's in his position, and I would hope that he stays there for quite a while.
Well, so would he.
Can I just say, one of the things that was really interesting, because Peter had told me that the work that education, health and sport are doing together, I went straight back to our minister, and actually I might have over-exaggerated slightly, Peter, but for effect, Because I absolutely believe, in this National Sport Plan, if health, sport and education cannot sign a commitment, I'm not asking for money, they don't have to do anything except say, you know what, we actually have shared values here. We actually believe that the future of our children are important. And so let's actually look at what we can do together. So I've had another meeting this week where I've repeated the same story. So your minister might get a call actually about that. But I think clearly you're leading the way in actually bringing those three very important departments together for the future of sport in this country.
I wanted to ask you a question about that because you raised the issue of obesity, childhood obesity, and of course, you know, no surprises, New Zealand has exactly the same problem as do all Western democracies across the globe. There's nothing new here, right? So we've known for a long time that our children are getting fatter and fatter. So what is the roadblock? What is the thing you think that stops us moving from recognising it and people such as the people in this room wanting to do something about it and actually being able to translate that into something tangible?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really challenging one for every nation, obviously, because if it was easy, it had been fixed by now. Interestingly, I met with the CEO of ACARA, which is our curriculum authority, and he drew a graph up on a whiteboard for me and said, this is what's happening to our children. So here are obesity rates, here's the decline in physical activity. And he said, this is a 10-year trend, this is a global trend. And he said, what I don't want to happen is in 10 years' time, if I'm still in this role, for someone to come up to me and say, didn't you know about that? Did you know about that? And you didn't do anything about it? And so I guess what I'm seeing, I keep telling myself, I know this, so what part can sport and physical activity, and this is why we're breaching into the physical activity space. So I think you call it recreation here, our state departments call it sport and active recreation, we call it physical activity. So for us it's about how do we get more Australians moving more often. We'll have some detractors because they think that's going to take away from sport. I fundamentally believe that the more people that are active, the more capable they are from a physical literacy perspective, means they'll have a lifetime involvement, but they'll also more people will play sport. So how do we get that supply area side ready for that? So I don't think there's a silver bullet for this, but it's about awareness. It's a call to action, and I think some of our campaigns that we have in Australia don't have a call to action. England are really good at this, and they're starting to get inroads. And our colleague Jenny Price, the CEO of Sport England, is coming in July to speak at a conference in Australia. And you know what they are doing, the data, the information they have about population activity is extraordinary. So I see that as the evidence. So our health budget in Australia, as I said earlier, is going like this. And we know sport and physical activity or active recreation is not the only answer, but it's part of solving the problem of this population health issue. And for our children to be like that, it's horrendous. So you all play your part already. So I think that's a great thing, and then I think your minister acknowledged that today. But how do we connect with others that are playing a part? So who are the other sorts of organisations that we can partner with, who are doing innovative things? That sport's sometimes a little bit bound by tradition. So innovation in how we deliver will be critical. We're still delivering a lot of traditional product in Australia that is, I think from a sport perspective, it's really disappointing. It's hard though because you're moving a big federated structure around. I mean, Europe and the UK fit into Australia. It's not easy, but unless we believe it's possible, we're not going to start.
You've touched on a point that was raised by one of the delegates here today, which is not something I expected to get in a question at a delegation full of sports people, but. It was really a comment, and it said sport is a turn-off for many people.
Yeah.
So first, do you accept that?
Yep, absolutely.
And then where do you see recreation, play, games and enjoying the great outdoors as being fundamental to physical activity? And you've kind of touched on that, but I guess sometimes that gets lost in the wash, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, and look, the reality is the facts are that from a physical activity or active recreation perspective in Australia, more people walk. more people ride their bikes. So how do we actually make sure that sport can play its part in this puzzle, I guess? So absolutely, us being able to, we've talked to a range of companies that are doing very innovative things in getting people moving. Interestingly, often it is the trigger for them to go back to the sport they played when they were children, because they feel fitter and more confident. But I think it's absolutely a fact. In actual fact, my first meeting when I started, I'm not from government, so I apologise for that. That I don't want to be recognised as someone from government, not because I'm critical of it, but I actually feel constrained by it. And I sat in a room with some representatives from the health department that run a campaign in Australia that is about getting people moving. And I was asking her, why doesn't the Australian Sports Commission do this? Isn't this about physical activity and sport and getting people involved and engaged in moving? And she said, because our data shows that most people in Australia don't like sport. And, I don't like sport much either. And I thought, in those moments you're sitting there going, oh my God, this job's going to be harder than I thought it was going to be. But interestingly, and I think this is why relationships and understanding and commonality, shared values, once we got through that bit, they actually are now starting to talk about collecting all the things up that sit in health at the moment that we could be accountable and responsible for, so that we're not spending money that's cross purposes and things like that. So it'll be an interesting. It frustrates me with massive respect to my Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister and Cabinet invest in a walking challenge in Australia, which is invested in the Heart Foundation. Now, I know heart health is a really huge issue for Australians as well, but imagine if sport was connected with that. Imagine if sport, who reaches almost every part of our community, almost every single person, if we engaged well and we were better at that, Prime Minister would ring us up and say, can't you do this? Can you work with the Heart Foundation to do that? I think we could, and imagine how we could amplify that program. The fact that if they give the Heart Foundation those funds, if the Heart Foundation rang us up and said, would you work with us, I would say absolutely we will, because it's really important for Australians' health. And means they're acting.
What you're describing is kind of the virtuous circle, isn't it? From having, from moving away from being associated only with a traditional offering, if you like, which both countries do very well, to being a more inclusive sector. Because inclusion here, and you talked about diversity, and let's talk about that for a moment, but inclusion is surely part of the way to get those messages across and to get more people participating.
Absolutely. In Australia, if you look at our data, our population is growing through immigration. So there are lots of people that our traditional sports, they don't actually even understand. But it means our population's growing, but sport is staying at the same level. So in actual fact, I would see sport participation's going down. And part of the challenge is that we're going to be increasingly irrelevant if we don't start to listen to what people are saying. Look at we're putting a lens on, and this is not new, every industry does this, from a customer perspective, rather than here's our sport, this is what our sport is, I like it or lump it. And I think I described it before about try and design with everyone in mind. Design your program so that everyone can participate. It's not easy, but there are experts in this area, the people that actually do this. So use those people to help inform your program design and make sure you measure and evaluate properly so that you can see where you're getting traction. So I actually think it's about what's possible, because this is where your growth will come from. This is your opportunity to make sure that every New Zealander, every Australian feels like they belong, because sport is a powerful force in that way. It can actually change people's lives. So, if I say that though to our minister without any evidence, the data, he'll say, "Well, go back and tell me what the return on that investment is," which is right. I mean, he's got to look after the funds we have. So I think the opportunity is massive in that particular space. And I suppose the disability space has been one that I guess I'm equally passionate about, because there's no reason for young... I've talked a little bit about athletes, but athletes with intellectual disabilities are incredibly capable of participating in sport. And so, and it can be an absolute joy to do that. So I think how are we doing that as a nation? And what happens in Australia, there's lots of disparate little groups that deal with disability sport. Now, my ambition would be if we could bring, not all of them, because a couple of them are a bit big, but under one umbrella. So they did some things that were common, but then they each had their particular area. Then we would actually say, well, actually even just promoting the value of including people with intellectual disabilities in our lives. We have a young boy that actually is a mailman at the Australian Sports Commission. You know, he's a perfectly good mailman. He actually loves sport. It took me 5 minutes. I said, so do you like sport? He said, love sport. So which sports are you in? And off he went, like it was 20 sports, and he participates in them all. And I just, you know, for me that's an absolute joy.
A number of questions on inclusion from the audience. One of them is, what initiatives at both grassroots and or strategic levels is the Australian Sports Commission implementing to increase access for Indigenous people in sport?
Yeah, so this is...
Did I just see a grimace?
Yeah. Well, it's just a huge challenge for Australia, and you know, I was talking earlier about you know, how well you do this in New Zealand. It's something we can learn from. It's getting better, and some sports like the AFL and the NRL do this incredibly well, where they create pathways, just like every other person in Australia. Just because you happen to be Indigenous shouldn't mean that you can't participate. But you have to make, you know, sometimes you have to make some special allowances. So there's some really great things happening in the Northern Territory in particular. Sports have buses that go around and pick the children up and take them. That comes with its own risks, as I talked about before, about child safety. But pick children up and take them to training so that they can get there. There are huge barriers in the way of Australians, of people with from Indigenous background in Australia. But we're actually seeing it more and more. The other thing in Australia that's still happening is that a lot of people don't recognise as Indigenous. So, you know, it's something that culturally, the cultural awareness in Australia of Indigenous Australians is not strong. And it's getting better, but it's not strong. So it's something we're taking up just very practically on campus because we work with sport. So we have a reconciliation action plan. We acknowledge country. We actually, from a workforce perspective, look at how we can employ Indigenous people. So it's a big challenge for us, but it's a joint. Practically, I think it's just being inclusive and making sure that people feel comfortable. One of our most famous netballers, Marsha Duncan, came out a couple of years ago and talked about her experiences as an elite netballer and how often she felt quite excluded. She was one of the most talented netballers I've ever seen. Her brother obviously played rugby, but hearing what she said about how she was felt, she was all of her athletes, but she was obviously not obviously, but they'd embraced her, but the environment for her was quite challenging. So a long road to go actually on it.
There's a related question also from the floor, which was part statement, part question, and it says, in New Zealand, the minority groups, including Māori, Pacific Island and Asian sportsmen and women, all seek more support for their sports interests that include their cultural contexts, and that's often a link with their general well-being. Yeah. So what changes do you expect to see in Australia in this area if you're going to reach your vision?
Yeah, so we have a department who work very much directly with sports and trying to change the way, you know, making sure that they are more inclusive, that they're culturally aware. We have, you know, immigrants coming into Australia, and we use sport as a vehicle to bring them into communities. I always remember the story that Jenny Price from England told us, though, about some of the populations in England who actually cluster in one particular area, and children growing up in that area, she said, was, and I can't remember the culture, but she said that the children actually don't know that they're living in England. They think they're still living, well, they're living in a community that look very much like them. So they're actually trying to break that down by taking those children out of those communities. I don't mean that physically, you know, taking them to sport and in making sure that they're playing sport in other parts, so that they actually acknowledge that there are other people in the country where they live. So I think we can learn a lot from the work that in England have done. an enormous amount from what New Zealand have done around inclusivity.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation about accessibility, or one of the themes that was identified in the initial, from one of the tables, was about accessibility. And just some thoughts on that. I mean, I guess as a parent of children, obviously in New Zealand and not Australia, but the one thing that you realise when your children get to be sports playing age is that it's expensive. Often it's expensive.
Yeah.
And you could see how that could be a barrier to wider participation for a lot of Kiwi families, and I'm assuming the same thing applies in Australia.
Yeah, look, the cost of sport in Australia is increasing, and it is becoming a barrier. One of the most successful initiatives, it's quite expensive, but a lot of our states now have a voucher system. Some are means tested, some aren't, where you are provided with a voucher to pay your fees to the sporting organisation. At the moment, the data, and it hasn't been fully evaluated, but it looks like the trend of participation of children in sport in New South Wales in particular, where it's not means tested, every single child is given a voucher, the participation rates are starting to go up. So if they're designing programs for impact, the participation will go up, but hopefully the impact on those children will also increase. But I think the reality with we've got a long way to go in the inclusive space, and I must admit I tell a story about my colleague at the Australian Sports Commission who's in a wheelchair, and we went to a meeting. We're in the middle of the city in Melbourne, and we have a driver that picks her up, and the driver backed up into a lane to get her wheelchair and her out because it was a busy street in Melbourne. And all of the, and apologies to all the bike riders here, I'm a bike rider too, but all the lycra-clad executives who were riding into work on their sort of $10,000 bikes started to swear at her. And it was those moments where and I got really angry. Like I was just, oh my God, how do you put up with this? And her face, she was so serene. And then I realised this is because this is what she faces every day. And, so it was for us this thing about how do we design our streets, our how, everything about our community so that, that places, spaces stuff, so that it means that people in wheelchairs can get out of the car without being abused. But what does that, and all I went straight to was, well, what's that mean for sport in their ability to access our buildings and some of our facilities. I think we're much better at that now than we used to be.
Last question, and this is from the floor. You mentioned a revolution in governance is coming. What do you see as a more effective structure for sport in the future, rather than the federal club setup?
Yeah, well, look, the reality is in Australia, and it's very different here, but in Australia, the federated structure is it's almost soul destroying actually. So you've got this, so state bodies are extraordinarily good at what they do. So they actually deliver directly to communities. They're generally reasonably well resourced, have reasonably good management capable people and boards. And then you have the national body who's trying to change things, is trying to put things in place. And it just slows everything down extraordinarily. So there's it's all about power politics, really. So in Australia, if you said, could we start again, the absolutely unitary model, one entity is the answer. It is the only answer. So what we're working on at the moment is a one management model, and in actual fact, and sorry to call you out, Michael, but Michael Scott, in his role at Rowing Australia, showed the effectiveness of bringing everyone together to work under one financial model, an evolution around programming that was consistent across the country. I met with actually Rowing Australia on Saturday, and he's an organisation that's really well set up for the future from a governance perspective and a management, highly capable people. And more sports are doing that. Sailing has done it, golf are on the way, where this one management model will mean that the workforce is employed by a central body, and there's really one strategy, so not one national sport strategy and then lots of different little strategies connecting everything up. So whether we achieve that or not, we're certainly on a really important journey in this space. But the reality is our investment needs to be used as a lever to encourage that change, because if we invest in shiny baubles before all of the really foundation and fundamental things are in place, then we'll have lots of nice shiny baubles that are not sustainable, but we won't have a really strong, healthy system. Because the potential for our industry is huge if we get it right, and I think that's the thing that probably drives us, our organisation, certainly drives our board, that we need a collective voice. We don't even have a collective voice for sport in Australia. So we play our role, but what about all of you? Who speaks on your behalf, separate to your agencies? So what are the big pictures things? So the Coalition of Major Professional and Participation Sports in Australia is a really, so all the big boys, plus netball, now I think golf and basketball might be joining, and that actually looks at all the big meaty issues, and then they actually work together to either lobby or influence government or whoever they're trying to influence. So, sorry, I've gone a little bit off track there, but the importance is of actually making sure that there is a strong, clear direction for every sport. And while we're fractured and fragmented, I can tell you the sports that do it first, and this is why rowing is growing, and rowing is being more commercially successful, because they almost got there first. So the sport that does this first is going to be driven ahead, I think. They will actually, I always used to say that about athletics, actually, to Athletics Australia. If they could bring all the athletics entities together under one banner, they would take over the world. But we rely on them staying very fragmented. Well, in my old role, that's what I thought. Oh, great, athletics is still really fragmented. Stay that way, because that means we're going to be better off. Now my job is to say, come on, you lot. Who wants to get there first? You're competitive. I'm throwing you a challenge. Go for it.
Kate, it's been a delight. Thank you very much. And I'd just ask Moana to come up and give you the official thanks.
Firstly, thank you for coming to our beautiful country, Aotearoa, and especially to a wonderful winter Wellington. Fantastic that our countries are connecting and supporting each other on kaupapa, like physical literacy, like an inclusive system. It's also pleasing to hear you talk about the start of partnership in terms of your Indigenous people. Sport New Zealand is embarking on a cultural change, and so that's another kaupapa that we may be able to share. So, nō reira, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.